So here we've got the Synchro-Compur shutter from a Kodak Retina IB camera, one big B. So I'm going to strip this down and service it. So I'll start by removing the front lens group. There's a little clip here, just needs to lift it up very slightly and then turn the lens group anti-clockwise and it'll lift out. It's bayoneted in. Put that to one side. Flip it over. I've got my retaining ring on the back there, that can come off. The shim and the rear lens group. Usually I use a friction tool to remove that, so I'll just go and get one. This is the friction tool I'm using. And usually a lot of downward pressure and it'll get that loose. Of course it's not doing it today. Oh, that's better. Just needed to get some weight behind it. The advantage of using a friction tool, of course, is that no sharp edges, nothing to scratch. So there's our rear lens element that can come out, go with the other pieces. Start taking the rest of it apart. We can take the outer case off here, 3 screws for that. Two flathead or countersunk screws here. One plain screw here. I'll just pop these to one side. These 2 screws are different sizes. There's a smaller diameter screw in this position. There's a flash contact at the back here. There's a little screw that clamps that in place. Just back that screw off and we can take off the case. Here's our case, the gear that's pushed by the transfer shaft in the camera body, and just the pusher that moves this part along. Pop those to one side. Here's the shutter. You can probably see that those diaphragm blades are a bit grimy looking. It almost looks like there's some corrosion products visible right there where those blades are currently sitting overlapped. Yeah. Apart from that, what else can we see? Not an awful lot. There's a bit of oil staining around here on the back of the body. At the front, visible here some red lacquer that someone's marked that with. It doesn't look like those lines would ever have lined up. Here's the screw that stops that retaining ring from backing up. We can remove that. It's very tiny, this screw, and easily lost. So commonly is it lost that a lot of shutters you'll find that's missing, and it's pointless asking repairmen whether they've got a spare that they can give you because they probably ran out years ago. The retaining ring, you can unscrew that with the tip of your tweezers, but I suggest you use a toothpick. The advantage of using a toothpick is it's unlikely to scratch the metal. Looking at this, I can already see a few scratch marks from where somebody else has had a go at this. Lift that off. Lift off this front ring. This is the front lens mount. That's where the lens bayonet's on. this ring, if it'll lift off for us, has the aperture numbers on it, so that they're visible at the top of the shutter. It couples to this ring here at that point, and that ring, I'll lift this ring off completely. This ring here, that little tab couples to the fork of this lever. This lever directly controls the aperture. So that tab couples into there, so that when this ring is moved, it also moves that. And this ring couples to the black ring with the numbers on that you see at the top of the shutter. Here's the shutter speed settings ring. And these numbers down here in red, they're EV values, exposure values. So looking at this shutter, what can we see? Well, we lift off that plate at the front. This plate at the front is the shutter speed settings cam plate. And there's a bit of corrosion visible here. Means it's had some moisture in here at some stage, which is interesting because the camera really didn't show anything of that nature. Are there any other options there with that corrosion? Not especially. I mean, there could have been some incorrect servicing. Perhaps someone washed it out with alcohol at some stage and didn't dry it completely, but it's much more likely that there's some water ingress there, perhaps a splash, something like that. Moving this on with this is our shutter release lever. I can lift that up out of the way. This piece here, that's like the internal cocking ring, if you like, that couples to the mechanism on the outside to cock the shutter. This little bracket that flips backwards and forwards as the shutter's cocked, and that serves to stop you from being able to depress the shutter release button if the shutter's not cocked. If that was not the case, you'd press the shutter release button, the release button would go all the way down, and in doing so it would release the film advance lever to allow you to wind on to the next shot, and you would have wind on, losing one exposure. So that can come off. Let's get into this. This is the pinion, it's a little cocking pinion that cocks the main cam here. We'll unhook the spring from the main cam. See what sort of a state that's in. That's good. That's very good. If you count the tab here at 12 o'clock, this piece is sitting at about the 2 o'clock position. Now that's like a new spring. That's what a new spring looks like. More typically, when you find that, if that's at the 12, this piece is right round at the 3 o'clock, or even down towards the 4 o'clock position, which would mean that it's lost a lot of its tension, and its biggest problem with that is at the almost closed position, when this is as relaxed as it's going to be and has the least tension. This is a very good one. You don't see many like that. So I'll pop that to one side. The main cam should lift out. If I swing that round, that should wiggle up. Now it's a little bit grimy, it's a bit difficult to say if there's any corrosion there. I wouldn't expect to see much corrosion there because a lot of these parts are quite oily looking. This is the retard gear train. It's held in with 2 screws. This one at the end serves as the pivot and this one here serves as the adjustment, where it passes through the mechanism, through the speed train. The hole is enlarged. What that means is that you can swing the speed train inwards or outwards for lesser or greater engagement with the main cam. Let's get that screw to fall out of there. There it is. The screw head here is a little bit mutilated looking. Probably means someone's been a bit rough with it. But there's our retard gear train. This is the self-timer. Now, if the self-timer is set, the internal cocking ring, this piece, when you first release the shutter, that shifts, acts on this lever here, which allows the self-timer to start running down. As the self-timer runs down, it pulls on this little lever here, and this little lever is then pulled out of engagement, so it's no longer blocking the main blade actuating ring, and as a result that allows the action to complete, and then the shutter fires. So we can lift that speed train off. Here we've got the flash sync stuff. I'll pull that across into the cocked position, unhook that spring from the lever. There's two screws here, plain one there, and this one is a shoulder screw. And there's our return spring. That spring, it looks a bit grimy, it may or may not have some corrosion on it. I'll put the springs together in one place. This plate should lift off. This is our moving flash contact. This piece drives the flash sync mechanism. It's got a spring there which is quite strong, and it sets up this lot. We shift that, it unloads this to a large extent, and we can get that spring off. That spring drives the flash, the delay. It allows this to swing across, that sector gear, which drives this little gear, which is part of this pinion, which rattles up against those pallets there. That delay is there to delay the action of the shutter, delay the shutter from firing a measured amount of time after the flash contact is made, because flash bulbs take a certain and measurable amount of time to burn at peak brilliance. As a result, it's useful to have the flash bulb ignited before the shutter actually opens and closes to make the exposure, so that you've got the full use of the brilliance of the flash. Electronic flash, by comparison, is for practical purposes instantaneous, and so you don't need to delay that. The electronic flashes are triggered at the point where the blades are fully open. Okay, so a few more things to get off here. This screw can come off. It's holding this spring. That spring acts against the post here, which is on the setting lever for the self timer or the flash sync, and the other end of that spring just comes back against the case here. This is our B lever. The B lever's job is to drop in and block the action of the blade actuating ring when the blades are fully open, until such stage as you take your finger off the shutter release and allow it to settle. Now this spring here should come off that post. Just wriggle it off. That's the return lever for the B lever, return spring for the B lever. And we have one more tiny spring here on this lever. That's always entertaining to deal with. So I'm holding a toothpick over the centre there so it can't get away. I'll unhook the end of the spring like that. And I should be able to lift it out of the shutter and pop that to one side. So that's the small springs all dealt with, and nothing here is now sprung loaded anymore. We can take this apart from the back, and we've got 3 screws here on the back holding the setting lever for the diaphragm in place. Now this is a little bit stiff, not overly stiff, and as you can see there's no great stress on those diaphragm blades because they're not flexing, they're just moving smoothly. If they were oiled up to any large extent, as you move this lever, those blades would be stressing because you'd be trying to push them and they wouldn't want to push. So I'll get these 3 screws out. There's our lever. You can see that it's a bit greasy looking on the back. That would have accounted for a lot of the stiffness on that lever. That grease would have been sticking that flat surface. That runs round on this shim, which of course is also oily looking. And this lever will lift off. This is our setting lever for the self timer and the flash sink, the XM flash sink. And this little stud sticking up here, that is what the lever couples to, and this is what actually moves. If you move that, you're moving the setting ring below it, and that opens and closes the diaphragm blades. So these are, they've got quite a funny appearance to them. It appears to me that it might almost be graphite that I'm seeing on that. It may suggest that someone applied graphite powder on those blades in order to make the mechanism move smoother at some stage, but perhaps they did it before first taking it all apart and removing any oil and contaminants, because you can certainly see a lot of silvery stuff on here, which is probably graphite. Alright, so far so good. I'm going to split the case now. We've got 3 screws here. Now that one's loose. Look at the state of that. That screw head there is loose. It's not even tight at all. Now that screw head being loose like that, or having backed out in a hole, its head is quite polished. And the head would be polished because it's been rubbing on the setting lever below it, I'd say. It's been rubbing, yeah, it's been up against something. It's rubbing against the setting lever for the aperture. There's probably a point on here that's been rubbing on. 2 more screws and we can take this case apart. That screw's loose too. Now that's unusual, and it suggests to me that they were never tight. This screw was done up, but it wasn't tight. Now that's unusual. It may mean that someone wasn't careful when they were servicing the camera, and perhaps they were interrupted before they'd finished tightening the screws up. But that's a bit unusual. Now here, you can quite definitely see some powder here, graphite powder. And there's oil patches here. Those dark patches around the edges are oil. But there's a silvery stuff here, that's graphite powder. Let's pop the mechanism plate to one side. Here's the shutter case. Now, this tells me someone was servicing this who didn't know what they were about. There's a tiny little cross marked here and one scribed into the case, and somebody was using it as their guide to reassembly. But there's only one way this ring can fit into the case, because it has a little rivet at this point which fits into a hole in the case, so you can't put that ring in the wrong position. It will only go in one way. So that tells me if someone marked that first before disassembling it, they had no experience with this type of shutter and they were going in blind. So let's remove these 3 screws. We can tip this lot out. Well, that should just fall out, but it's all gummed up with oil. So our shutter case is quite a yellowy sort of colour there, you can see. That's all oil and grease. There's more silvery colour here. It's probably graphite, or it might be graphite grease. This is the ring that is swung to the left or the right to close the diaphragm blades down or open them up. That's in quite reasonable order. You can see quite a bit of oily grease around the outside edge, and on the front face, of course, you can see quite a bit of graphite powder. Now, there's nothing particularly bad about graphite powder in shutters, but you typically only use it to lubricate things like diaphragm blades after you've got everything absolutely oil free, and then you work it in and then you blow it out, and of course it doesn't stick to surfaces that aren't all oily. But these blades are quite definitely covered in the stuff. That shouldn't cause any problems, and that will clean away very easily. One of the reasons you don't want graphite powder left inside a shutter is that inevitably any powder that's there will find its way onto the insides of the glass lens at some stage. And it's quite silvery. I mean, it's quite reflective, so it would probably end up, you'd have a loss of contrast if you had any amount of graphite powder settling on the inside of a glass lens surface. Here you can see graphite powder quite clearly at that point. And this cover plate on this surface, you can see where the shutter blades have sat for a considerable period of time, and it's left its imprint where it was parked there. Now, whether that imprint mark there is as a result of some corrosion because moisture's got in there, or whether that's where there was oil and the oil has dried out, effectively oxidised, turned like a lacquer in that pattern, I don't know yet. It depends on whether that cleans off or not when I'm stripping it down. So much for that. Well, meantime, here's our mechanism plate. The shutter blades have helpfully fallen off here while we've been talking, but I'll gather them together. We can have a look at these. They certainly look cleaner on the front than on the back, which suggests that someone's had a go at cleaning it after it was assembled at some stage. No matter. Let's chip those out. Nothing wrong with them, there's no corrosion on them or anything. So our mechanism plate here. Okay, this piece is called the lens tube. It's held to the mechanism plate with 3 screws. Oh. This is a mixture because some of these screws are very tight and some of them are falling out. This piece, this little bracket which sits in this position, that holds our main spring, main drive spring on the main cam. The screw that goes through that is slightly longer than its two mates, to the order of about 1/4 millimetre, something like that. So easy to mix it up. If you put the short screw where the long screw should be, it won't be extending all the way through the mechanism plate, so it'll only catch on to a very small amount of thread, and so it's easily stripped out. Conversely, if you put the long screw where the short screw would be, it will stick out through the back of the mechanism plate and catch on shutter blades, which is undesirable because they won't swing. So this piece can come off. Here's the blade actuating ring. That's the piece that moves to swing the shutter blades in and out of, from open to closed and back again. That's quite greasy looking. That's probably graphite grease. It's otherwise in good order. And here's the bare mechanism plate. All we've got left on this now is that spring, and I advise you not to bother taking that off there. You can clean around it, and it's just another thing to lose if you do take that off. Here's the pallet. The pallet's job is to rattle backwards and forwards to control this. It effectively times the start time of your shutter opening after the flash has been fired. And you've got the greasy oily stains on here. You can certainly see that gleaming here and over here. That's where that was in contact with the case at this point. And so that is pretty much the shutter stripped down. And all of these parts will need to be cleaned to get rid of all the oil and dust and dirt and contaminants before it can be reassembled with appropriate lubrication.